The West Memphis Three, wrongly convicted or guilty. Teen killers. The three teenagers stood inside the small Arkansas courtroom, their hands cuffed and their faces pale. Reporters filled every corner, whispering and flashing cameras as the judge spoke in a steady voice. Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr., he said, "You are found guilty of the murders of the three 8-year-old boys." Gasps filled the room. Damien stared straight ahead, his black hair hanging over his face, while Jason and Jessie lowered their heads in disbelief. Damien was sentenced to death. Jason and Jessie were sentenced to life in prison. Outside the courthouse, angry voices shouted, "Justice for the boys!" But in another corner, people whispered, "They didn't do it." The truth seemed to split the whole town of West Memphis in two. Were these boys cold-blooded killers, or innocent teenagers trapped by fear and lies? Let's go back to where it all began. It was May 5, 1993, a warm spring evening in West Memphis, Arkansas. Three young boys, Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, set out to ride their bikes through their quiet neighborhood. They were only 8 years old, full of energy and laughter, and often played near a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. But when the sun went down that night, the boys didn't come home. Their parents searched the streets, calling their names until their voices cracked. Police officers were called, flashlights swept through the darkness, but there was no sign of them. By the next morning, fear spread through the small town like wildfire. Search teams combed the woods, the drainage ditches, and the muddy creek beds. Around 1 p.m., a police officer spotted a small sneaker floating in a ditch. When they pulled it out, they saw another. And then they found something that would change West Memphis forever. In a shallow, muddy ditch, the bodies of the three boys were discovered. They were stripped naked, tied with their own shoelaces, and left in the cold, dark water. The town fell into silence, and then came the cries. Parents clutched their children tighter that night. Everyone wanted answers. The police began working fast, but fear turned into pressure, and pressure turned into panic. The crime looked strange, ritual-like. Rumors spread about satanic worship and devil rituals. People whispered that someone in town must be involved with the occult. It didn't take long for fingers to point toward one teenager, Damien Echols. He was 18, dressed in black, listened to heavy metal, and read books about witchcraft. To many adults in town, that was enough to make him dangerous. Soon after, Damien's best friend Jason Baldwin and another boy, Jessie Misskelley Jr., who had an intellectual disability, were pulled in for questioning. Jessie was just 17 and had trouble understanding what was happening. Police questioned him for hours, without a parent or lawyer present. He was scared and confused. Eventually he said what he thought they wanted to hear. His words became a confession, but parts of it didn't match the evidence at all. Still, the police stopped looking elsewhere. The town wanted justice, and they wanted it fast. By the time the trial began in 1994, the courtroom was packed every day. News cameras flashed, and people lined up to see the satanic teenagers. There was no physical evidence linking them to the crime. No blood, no fingerprints, no DNA. Just rumors, a shaky confession, and their love for dark music. But when the verdict came down, guilty, the crowd outside cheered. They believed the nightmare was over. Yet far away in a small cell, Damien whispered, "We didn't do it." And soon strange things would start to happen that would make the world question everything the jury believed. Years passed, but the whispers about the case never faded. People from outside West Memphis began to take notice. Journalists, lawyers, and even musicians started digging into the story, wondering if something had gone terribly wrong. Inside prison walls, Damien Echols sat on death row. He was kept in a small cell, just big enough to pace in. Every night, he wrote in a notebook about his dreams, about freedom, and about the boys who died. Jason and Jessie were locked away too, each living through long, quiet days, trying to understand how their lives had changed forever. Meanwhile, outside the prison gates, doubts began to grow louder. Jessie's confession, once seen as the biggest piece of evidence, started to crumble. Experts said the police used leading questions, and Jessie, scared and confused, might have repeated things they told him. His story had changed several times, and many details didn't fit what was found at the crime scene. Even more troubling, there was no blood, no fingerprints, and no DNA connecting the 3 teens to the murders. Everything seemed based on fear, the fear of the unknown and the strange. In 1996, a group of filmmakers released a documentary called Paradise Lost. It showed the trial, the rumors, and how quickly the town turned against the boys. Millions of people across America watched it and began to question if justice had really been served. As the years went on, new evidence began to surface. Forensic scientists re-examined the case using improved DNA testing. What they found shocked everyone. None of the DNA from the crime scene matched Damien, Jason, or Jessie. But one piece of DNA found on a shoelace matched someone else, a stepfather of one of the victims. The news sent a chill through everyone who had followed the story. Could the real killer have been close to the boys all along? Back in prison, Damien got a letter from an investigator telling him about the new discovery. His hands, too, trembled as he read it over and over. After nearly 2 decades behind bars, hope started to flicker again. Lawyers began filing new appeals, arguing that the boys, now men, deserved a fair trial with real evidence, not fear and gossip. But freedom wouldn't come easy. The state of Arkansas refused to admit wrongdoing. To reopen the case, they needed to prove not just that there were mistakes, but that the 3 men were truly innocent. For years, hearings dragged on, and every time Damien stepped into court, he could feel the eyes of people who still called him a monster. Then, in 2011, something unexpected happened. The prosecutors offered the men a deal called an Alford plea. It meant they could claim innocence but still plead guilty to the crimes, ending the case once and for all. It was the only way for them to go free without forcing the state to admit it made a mistake. The choice tore them apart inside. Plead guilty to something they didn't do, or stay behind bars forever. Damien looked around the courtroom one last time, remembering the faces of the parents, the flashing cameras, and the years he had lost. The air was heavy, every eye watching, waiting for his answer. Then, with his voice shaking, he said quietly, "I'll take the deal." The judge nodded. Papers were signed. After 18 long years, the West Memphis Three were finally released. Crowds outside cheered and cried as they stepped into the sunlight for the first time as free men. But the story didn't end there. Because while Damien, Jason, and Jessie walked free, no one else was ever charged for the murders. And somewhere in West Memphis, someone still knew what really happened in those woods that night. Freedom felt strange. The air smelled different. The colors seemed brighter, but the world had moved on without them. Damien, Jason, and Jessie stepped out into a life they no longer recognized. Writers swarmed them, asking questions they didn't have answers to. Cameras flashed in their faces as if their pain was a movie. At first, it felt like victory. People called them heroes, symbols of justice finally corrected. Celebrities spoke their names, documentaries praised their strength, and lawyers smiled for the news. But when the lights faded and the crowds disappeared, the reality hit. They were free, but not innocent in the eyes of the law. Their names still carried the word murderer. Damien moved far from Arkansas, trying to build a quiet life. He often spoke about the nightmares that never stopped, how the sound of metal doors slamming shut would wake him in the night. Jason stayed mostly silent, working quietly, while Jessie tried to adjust to a world that felt too fast for him. None of them were the same boys who had once been accused. They had grown into men shaped by fear, loss, and confusion. Still, questions continued to haunt West Memphis. Parents of the murdered boys still mourned, but even they began to wonder, had justice truly been served? Detectives had retired, witnesses had vanished, and memories had faded. Yet something dark still hung over the small town. In 2020, new lawyers began pushing for more DNA testing. Technology had advanced even more, and now they could test samples that were too small decades ago. When the new results came in, the findings deepened the mystery. Again, no trace of Damien, Jason, or Jessie, but there were partial matches suggesting another person connected to the victims, a family member. The police, however, refused to reopen the case. Across America, people demanded answers. True crime fans, journalists, and podcasters kept the story alive. They replayed every interview, reread every police report, and asked the same question over and over. If the West Memphis Three didn't kill those boys, then who did? One night, Damien sat alone, looking at old photos from 1993, the ones of 3 small boys smiling on their bikes before they vanished into the woods. He whispered softly, "Whoever did this, they're still out there." His voice cracked with a mix of sorrow and anger. And maybe they're still walking free. He closed the photo album and looked out the window. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets and the thick Arkansas trees, the truth waited, buried deep, hidden behind decades of fear and silence. The West Memphis Three had gained their freedom, but not their peace. The real story was still unfinished, the truth still lost in the muddy waters of Robin Hood Hills. And as the town lights flickered that night, the same question echoed across America. Were they truly guilty? Or were 3 innocent boys sacrificed for justice that never came?